ọ̀la ńlẹ̀ yìí tiwa. Awólọ́wọ̀ tó alága Akíntọ́lá ó tiwa ni. Awólọ́wọ̀ tó alága Bọ̀dé Dẹ́pútì tiwa.
By the end of their time in office, the unanimous verdict of the Nigerian public on the performance of the Action Group in office was that they had done superlatively well. The Action Group had promised the people of Western Nigeria education for their children, health for children up to the age of 18 years, freedom from lack, and most of all, freedom from British rule. As Nigeria drew to the ends of the 1950s, Southwest Nigeria was the place to reside in. Obafemi Awolowo had led a team of technocrats in government that has never been seen in the annals of governance in Nigeria before and probably may never be seen again. In 1918, the war that was supposed to end all wars, the First World War, was brought to an end. Along with this war also came a colossal loss of human lives, with approximately 14 million people dead. The victorious nations in Europe, which will include Britain and France, decided to exert a heavy toll on Germany, which was the country at the center of the conflict. The Germans resented this action, and along with the economic challenge that came with the Great Depression, they began to look everywhere for anyone who could salvage the situation. It was at this time that Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party began to sell an Eldorado to the German people. Hitler was voted Chancellor of Germany in 1932, and soon enough he acquired all constitutional powers to himself and made himself the maximum ruler of Germany. The Nazi Party espoused a far-right doctrine that the German people were an exalted race and any other race was inferior to them. Soon they began to persecute the Jews and also acquire lands beyond the boundaries of Germany. On the 3rd of September 1939, Great Britain and France declared war on Germany. This was 2 days after Germany had invaded Poland. The Second World War had begun in earnest. This war was carried on for another 6 years before it was brought to an end with the suicide of Adolf Hitler on April 30, 1945. By the end of that conflict, approximately 75 million people had died in the war. Great Britain alone lost no less than 1 million men in the two great wars. The loss of men will bear heavily on the colonial endeavors of Britain all around the world. By the middle of the 1930s, the Indian people had begun to champion an end to British rule in their country. In 1947, the British granted India full independence. All the while Obafemi Awolowo was working at Wesley College in the early 1930s, he was keeping himself up to date with happenings in India. The non-violent politics and philosophy of Mahatma Gandhi were carefully imbibed by Awolowo. With time, Obafemi Awolowo learned from Indian politics that federalism was the most effective political model to run in a culturally and ethnically diverse country like Nigeria. Obafemi Awolowo became convinced of federalism as a political structure in 1940. When he shared these ideas with his friends at the Nigerian youth movement, his ideas were shut down. His friend did not think that federalism was a workable political ideology for Nigeria. Awolowo's first years at the Nigerian youth movement will be his training ground for politics, and those years are worth exploiting if we will understand the underlying ideology of the Action Group, which is the political party Awolowo and others formed in the early 1950s that brought Nigeria into a new political dispensation. Awolowo understood quickly in life what he was called to do, and he had a single-minded commitment to achieving those goals. Obafemi Awolowo admits in his writings that the creation of modern Nigeria is the work of the British. What he disapproved of was the notion that the indigenous people of the land could not govern themselves well. He felt that the white man was just as human as he was, and what the white man could do, he could do also, and probably better. This is what led to him to conclude early in life that his calling was to be a politician. Awolowo felt that God had called him to serve his people by bringing good governance to them. As he kept the goal of becoming a politician in sight, he also understood that the path towards this goal were two professions. journalism, and law. Obafemi Awolowo learned that the British took documentation very seriously. In fact, he realized early that people who got into trouble with the local British authorities in Nigeria when he was a child were people who could articulate their thoughts in writing. He saw quickly that public opinion could be easily swayed through writing, and the moment he had the opportunity, he entered into the murky waters of journalism. In the 1930s, when Obafemi Awolowo was writing articles for different newspapers, he volunteered most of his writing through freelancing. He did business by the side. Awolowo's articles did ruffle some feathers even back then. For example, Obafemi Awolowo wrote an article criticizing the construction of a public library in Ibadan. The article was published in the Nigerian Daily Telegraph. The library was built by Mr. Ward Price, a British colonial administrator in Ibadan, and the man was particularly proud of the project. Awolowo stated essentially in his article that the library was too small and way below the status of Ibadan as a city. The article was so pungent that the colonial government of that time decided to close the library down. Mr. Ward Price reported Awolowo to the local leaders of Ibadan and told them that it was this person who had deprived the whole city of the use of a library. The leaders of Ibadan at that time asked Awolowo to come and see them. Awolowo understood that if he were to report himself to those men, he would very likely be mobbed or sent to jail. He therefore got the support of some nationalists and newsmen, and the matter was settled amicably. The second profession that Awolowo embarked on to reach the height of his goal of becoming a politician was law. A lot more will be said about Awolowo's venture into law. Suffice to say here now that to fulfill his calling to become a politician, Obafemi Awolowo joined the politically conscious and nationalist group called the Nigerian Youth Movement, NYM. This group championed the idea of self-governance by Nigerians themselves. Awolowo was an avid reader of the Lagos Daily News, published by Herbert Macaulay, who was a frontline nationalist in those days. However, as Macaulay grew older, he became more and more autocratic and difficult to work with. He fell out with a number of his friends, and a few of them, most of them resident in Lagos, came together to form the Nigerian Youth Movement. The NYM from the start possessed the same fervor and vision that Herbert Macaulay had, but with a lot more energy because it was populated by younger men and was more democratic in its decision-making. Obafemi Awolowo joined the NYM in 1934. There was a need to create newer units of the group in other parts of the country, and Awolowo and others quickly got together to create the Ibadan chapter. The NYM had 3 charters they sought to pursue as vision and goals. There was the political charter of the group that sought to have Nigeria gain complete political autonomy from British rule. If this were to happen, members of the NYM would have to make themselves politically savvy and prove to the Nigerian people that they will be better administrators of the country than the British. The second charter of the NYM was an economic one. Here, the group sought to have Nigerians enjoy the same economic advantage that the British had within the country. The third charter was a cultural and social one. Here, they sought to bring education to all Nigerian people. It was here the idea of free education was first suggested in the country. In fact, the NYM wrote a number of memoranda to the British insisting that education should be made free for all young Nigerians, so as to expedite the process of training and raising manpower for Nigeria to take over from the British. The founding members of the NYM were Mr. N.S. Ikoli, Oba Samuel Akinsoya, and Chief H.O. Davis. In 1937, when Nnamdi Azikiwe returned to Nigeria from his studies in the United States of America, he joined the NYM. The other option for him was to join the NDP of Herbert Macaulay, or for him to bat his own political party. Zik chose to work with an established team, the NYM, and the NYM were too glad to have him because they were hoping to count on his newspaper, the West African Pilot, to project their views to the public. In 1938, just on the eve of the Second World War, and Britain at its wits' end on discouraging Adolf Hitler from entering another destructive war, there were very strong rumors that the British were considering giving Nigeria to the Germans. At this time, the Germans had already entered into negotiations with the Italians to take over the running of Tunisia. The NYM took up a number of public campaigns and wrote endless memoranda to the Secretary of the Colonies, insisting that Nigeria should not be handed over to the Germans. They kept at this campaign until the British made it clear that they would not be giving Nigeria to Hitler. On another occasion, the NYN championed the first strike action ever embarked on in Nigeria. In 1937, the British decided that it needed to do something to improve the profit margin of rail system in the country. Public commentators like Awolowo argued that the problem was not that there was no profit in the railway, but that there was so much corruption in the ranks and files of the civil servants working there. The government paid little attention to this point, but chose to double the license fees that lorries plying the same routes as the train were plying. This way, the cost of transporting goods via the roads will increase and people will patronize the railway instead. When the NYM discovered that the government was still going ahead with its plans, they got in touch with the road transport workers and called for a strike. For 5 days, the lorries did not ply the roads, and the manufacturers began to feel the bite of the strike. The government was eventually compelled to return the licensing fees to what it originally was. The strike was successful. The NYM was becoming a strong political force in the country before its ranks and files became divided and the group ceased to be in 1944. In June 1967, the Nigerian Civil War broke out. Many people have wondered what caused the Civil War. It is safe to say somewhat that the Nigerian Civil War began within the Nigerian youth movement. The NYM was battered as a truly Nigerian nationalist and political group. In fact, the original name was the Lagos Youth Movement. The name was changed to Nigerian in 1936 when there was clamor from other parts of the country for the group to be replicated there. So the group began on a truly Nigerian nationalistic broad view. There were no ethnic divisions amongst them. There was no religious division. The central vision was wresting power from the colonial people and having Nigerians govern themselves. The divisions in the NYM began with Nnamdi Azikiwe and the West African pilot. The NYM had depended completely on the pilot to provide the public with her political views and aspirations. Unfortunately, the group realized late that the West African pilot was giving more attention to tribal leanings. Azikiwe, who would later be known as Zik, encouraged the publishing of news items to extol the achievements of people from eastern Nigeria, while they gave little attention to people from other parts of the country, particularly the West. At this time in Nigerian history, which will be around the late 1930s, a healthy competition had developed between the Yorubas and Igbos in educational attainment. Unfortunately, the pilot would often publish foreign degrees received by Igbos on its front page, while they reported other tribes' achievements in a little corner within the pages of the paper. There were also occasions when the pilot publicly criticized the views of leaders of the NYM. Zik's attention was brought to these matters, but it did not stop. The final nail to the coffin of the group came with the 1941 election into the Legislative Council in Lagos. Ernest Ikoli had been appointed the president of the NYM. When the seat to the Legislative Council was declared open, Ikoli indicated to his colleagues that he wished to run for that office. That same year, the NYM had agreed that if the president of the group indicated an interest in running for a political office, no other person in the group would run against him. Unfortunately, some individuals in the NYM felt that liberty should be given to others to run also, especially after Oba Samuel Akinsoya had indicated interest in running. The NYM passed the matter to the leadership of the group to decide, and the consensus within the leadership was that Ikoli was to run while Akinsoya should step down. Unfortunately, as the election drew near, it was discovered that Akinsoya had also taken up form and was gunning to occupy that office also. This situation split the NYM. One group believed that the group's constitution and agreement should be respected. The other group felt that on this one occasion, the decision of the group's leadership should not be followed. The campaign that followed this situation was bitter, tearing the once cordial group into bitter enemies. Oba Akinsoya teamed up with Zik, who used the pilot to pillory the others in the NYM as the election drew near. Sadly also, Akinsoya, who was Ijebu, cornered all the Ijebu members of the NYM to himself. At the same time, Zik got all the Easterners in the group to support Akinsoya. It was the first time ethnic sentiments was brought into Nigerian politics. Sadly, this very thing has never departed from this country's politics. The split within the NYM was so obvious to the public that even the Reverend I.O. Ransom Kuti, father of Nigeria's Afrobeat maestro, Fela Anikulapo Kuti, presided over a 12-hour meeting between the two groups, yet the matter was not resolved. On election day, neither candidate stepped down for the other, and the group went to the polls splintered. Ernest Ikoli, an Easterner, won the seat on the Legislative Council. The NYM then decided to expel all those who disobeyed the group's leadership's directive. Akisoya left the group with his Ijebu followers, Zik left the group with all members from the East, and the NYM never recovered. Efforts were made by H.O. Davis to revive it in 1949, but the group died out completely by the turn of the 1950s. One lesson that Awolowo took out of the 1941 crisis in the NYM was something that supported his theory of federalism. Awolowo understood that people tend to be more trusting of people who are of their own kith and kin. Therefore, politics should always exhume from the grassroots. In fact, the whole idea of political meetings held in a leader's house came from this idea. Politics should begin from the home, then the community, onto the local government, and then the state level, before one reaches the national stage. It was what will lead the sage to come to realize that a nation like Nigeria is best governed if it is divided up carefully along ethnic lines. This brings us to the subject of federalism and how Obafemi Awolowo became a convinced federalist. If he was going to become a politician of note who will help govern Nigeria along modern ideals, Obafemi Awolowo understood he would have to become somebody of note in society. He knew he would need money. From his days living in Abeokuta, Awolowo had noticed that people who practiced the law profession earned very well. He had made frantic efforts to write the entrance examination, the BCom's London examinations in June 1944, and he passed. He left the shores of Nigeria on 14th August 1944 to study law in the United Kingdom. He left behind his dear wife, who was 7 months pregnant with their fourth child. Obafemi Awolowo did not only go to the United Kingdom to study law, but he also used the period to form alliances with other Nigerian students who were out there to get an education. It was while he was in the UK studying that he, along with a few others, formed the Egbe Oduduwa. It was clear to everyone that the British, who were war-weary at the time, were not going to continue colonial rule. Public opinion in Britain was shifting away from colonialism to preserving the resources of the country and using them to build the war-torn nation back up. America was also becoming a superpower by then, and the Americans were making it clear to the British that if they would continue to enjoy their support, they would have to end colonialism. Awolowo and other students in the UK knew that in a matter of time, the governing of Nigeria would be handed over to Nigerians themselves. It was while he was in the United Kingdom that Obafemi Awolowo wrote Path to Nigerian Freedom, which was his first book. The main thesis of that book was that Nigerians recognized that the British created the Nigerian political space. We also recognize that there are economic reasons for this creation. However, Awolowo posited that the British should recognize that colonialism is a fading ideology in the world and that no people will ever sit back and watch their country being ruled by foreigners. For this reason, the British must consider that it's about time to relinquish the government of the country to able hands. It is true that governance will require skill, and many Nigerian people, mostly the youths, are acquiring the requisite education to be able to govern their own country. Nigeria would continue to abide by the democratic principles that the British had founded the country on, while at the same time recognizing the age-old monarchical systems that exist in Nigerian communities and employing them to help in the whole system of governance. Obafemi Awolowo argued in the book that the country is run by laws, and as long as the governing bodies and the governed abided by the constitution of the country, the nation is likely to grow and abide in peace and prosperity. Awolowo made it clear that the Nigerian people resented the idea of foreigners ruling over them and wished to be free from British rule. As regards the type of political structure that should run within Nigeria, Obafemi Awolowo suggested federalism. It was in this book he wrote the famous words that is worth quoting in full. If rapid political progress is to be made in Nigeria, it is high time we were realistic in tackling its constitutional problems. Nigeria is not a nation, it is a mere geographical expression. There are no Nigerians in the same sense as there are English, Welsh, or French. The word Nigeria is merely a distinctive appellation to distinguish those who live within the boundaries of Nigeria and those who do not. There are various national or ethnic groups in the country. 10 such groups are recorded during the 1931 census as follows: Hausa, Igbo, Yoruba, Fulani, Kanuri, Ibibio, Thief, Edo, Nupe, and Ijo. According to the Nigerian Handbook, 11th edition, there are also a great number of other small tribes too numerous to enumerate separately. When people read these words, which Awolowo penned around 1945 while he was still a student in England, they conclude that the man was saying that Nigeria was not a nation. What he meant was that Nigeria was a conglomerate of nations, and that what will make this country a cohesive unit is a constitutional system that is genuinely federal in spirit, and that will recognize every single one of these tribes or groups and then give them a say in the national question. When everybody has a sense of belonging to the Nigerian nation, we can then begin to speak of Nigeria as a single nation. Awolowo gave examples of countries like Germany, Switzerland, India, and even Great Britain, which were all a conglomerate of nations, but which had succeeded in coming together through a federal system. Awolowo's ideas behind federalism will eventually inform the Nigerian government's decision to create states. Awolowo maintained that Nigeria could actually afford to have as many states as possible, as long as each of them were viable, because people tend to be able to associate with others politically when members of the group share the same language and ethnicity. Therefore, a state should consist of people speaking the same language or who share as close as possible historic origins. When the government of Yakubu Gowon divided Nigeria into 12 states in 1967, he was following these tested principles of federalism. And every other time states have been created in Nigeria, the aim was to help more and more people have a sense of belonging to the Nigerian project. The problem, however, is that if federalism as a political ideology will work, Nigerians must be consistent in following its principle. For example, the number one reason for creating a state should not be merely because a people are agitating for one, but mainly because that state is viable, that they are able to source for their own resources to develop their state while at the same time contributing to the center. Unfortunately, today, the federal system is being abused because the chief reason people agitate for states is not so that they may be able to contribute to the center, but rather to get resources from the center. Awolowo's ideas on federalism were strengthened by what happened at the Nigerian youth movement. A lot of it was the result of his political battle with Nnamdi Azikiwe. In 1943, the Igbo Federal Union was created and Zik was elected as its first president. In the same year, the Ibibio Union was formed. As of 1943, the Yorubas did not have a union of people. In fact, it was extremely difficult to form one because less than a century before this time, most of Yoruba land was at war with each other. A culture of suspicion and mistrust abounded among the Yoruba, and Awolowo was convinced that if his federalist ideas were going to work, people of the same ethnic persuasion needed to come together. This was what informed the birth of the Egbe Omo Oduduwa in England by Obafemi Awolowo, Oni Akirele, Abiodun Akirele, Akitola Williams, and Ayotunde Rosiji in 1945. All of them were students in England at the time, and Awolowo used the opportunity to bring them together. The formation of the Egbe Omo Oduduwa was not without stringent criticism from many Nigerian students, particularly those of Igbo extraction, who felt that Awolowo was propounding a political movement that was aimed at fractioning Nigeria. His appeal to them to understand the federal nature of the Egbe and the fact that the Igbos had created an ethnic group themselves fell on deaf ears. Awolowo sent the aims and objectives of the Egbe to Obas and leading Yoruba leaders in Nigeria and encouraged the birthing of a similar group in the country. In 1948, the Egbe Omo Oduduwa was formed formally in Nigeria, but led this time by Adeyemo Alakija, Akinola Maja, Kofo Abayomi, Bode Thomas, H.O. Davis, Akoni Doherty, and others. Many of these men had worked with Obafemi Awolowo while they were with the Nigerian youth movement. Thus, the creation of the Egbe was not in opposition to the earlier one created in London. Awolowo received the news of the creation of the Egbe with joy. Subsequently, it was agreed that the Egbe would not be a political group, but rather a social and cultural one that would lend a voice to political issues but would not be involved in partisan politics. It should also be noted that in May 1948, the Northern People's Congress was formed in northern Nigeria. As the question of self-government was being discussed, constituent parts of the country began to see the need to coalesce into political and cultural groups. This is a natural thing and still in keeping with the federalist principle that Obafemi Awolowo expounded in his lifetime. In 1966, while in prison, Obafemi Awolowo did an extensive study of different constitutions around the world and reached a conclusion that he published in his book titled Thoughts on the Nigerian Constitution. He stated categorically that if a country is unilingual and uninational, its constitution must be unitary. If a country is unilingual or bilingual or multilingual and also consists of communities which over a period of years have developed divergent nationalities, the constitution must be federal and the constituent states must be organized under dual state. If a country is bilingual or multilingual, the constitution must be federal and the constituent states must be organized on a linguistic basis. Any experiment with a unitary constitution in a bilingual or multilingual or multinational country must fail in the long run. Awolowo reached this conclusion after examining every constitution in every country on the sixth continent of our world where some constitutional democracy was being practiced. Nigeria is obviously a multilingual and multinational state, and only a federal constitution will work for her. The idea behind federalism does not stop in Nigeria alone. It extends to the concept of a united Africa. If individual countries in Africa succeed at practicing a federal constitution, since most countries in Africa are multilingual and multinational, then all the constituent nations can come together in both political and economic ties, something close to what we have in the European Union today. Awolowo was such a committed federalist that the motto of the Action Group when it was formed in 1950 was Unity through Federalism. It was the same concept of unity that Awolowo envisaged when he and others battered the Unity Party of Nigeria in the Second Republic. Consequently, it was this unity he felt he must fight for when he joined Northern Nigeria against the East as the nation waged a bloody 30-month war between 1967 and 1970. Federalism was not just a word for Obafemi Awolowo. It was an undergirding doctrine for him, so that every time Nigeria flirted with a unitary kind of government, the country paid for it dearly. The country is challenged up to date because although Nigeria claims to be a federal republic, the country is not practicing federalism in the true sense of the word. Still in London, Obafemi Awolowo wrote his law exams and passed them. On the 18th of November 1946, he was called to the bar as a member of the Honourable Society of the Inner Temple in England. He returned to his dutiful wife and 4 children that same year. In his absence, Hannah Idowu Dideolu Awolowo, who would later be known in Nigeria as HID, had kept the family front going with her business. The business had grown and the family was quite comfortable. Now as a practicing lawyer, Obafemi Awolowo had become a man of financial means himself. He was making an average income of £4,300 a year. He would have preferred his wife not to do business, but he could not shut down her business because the woman had done incredibly well for herself. He, however, succeeded in ensuring that she controlled her chain of business concerns from their Ibadan residence in Okeado. In the years ahead, Obafemi Awolowo would owe his financial fortitude to his wife's businesses. Because having come under heavy political persecution, it was HID that held the family together and helped to sustain the children in school, while he endured many legal battles and was sent to jail also. Awolowo described his wife as my jewel of inestimable value. All of his life he remained greatly indebted to this woman who stood by him through thick and thin. It was said that while he held the fort in political gathering outside the home, he made it clear to anyone who cared to listen that his wife was the head of the family inside the home. In fact, it was said that the sage never sat at the head of the table when they ate together. He left that spot for his wife, Hannah. As his income improved, Obafemi Awolowo turned his attention to 2 things, journalism and politics. While politics was the end, he also understood that it was important to educate the minds of the masses with regards to his plans, policies, and pursuits in politics. He could not rely on the West African pilot because at this time he had fallen out politically with Zik. The only other option was to bat a newspaper. In 1949, the Yoruba nation did not have a voice in the print media, and so Obafemi Awolowo stepped into that vacuum with the bat of the Nigerian Tribune. The Tribune had the following vision at its bat: to promote the welfare agenda of Obafemi Awolowo, to speak for the downtrodden Nigerian and to espouse the views of the Yoruba nation at a time when many newspapers had divided into ethnic voices. The Nigerian Tribune is today the oldest print media in the country. It is the only one of the newspapers backed in colonial Nigeria that is still in existence. The Tribune endured many years of political persecution and has won its place in the annals of Nigerian journalism. President Ibrahim Babangida, who ruled Nigeria between 1985 and 1993, said that the editorial opinion of the Tribune was the only piece he read when he was in office. Having placed a foothold on the minds of the populace through his newspaper, Obafemi Awolowo turned his attention to politics. It was clear that the Nigerian youth movement could no longer be resuscitated. There was a need to create a new political group that would challenge for office, as the body language of the British indicated that colonial rule was not going to last much longer. On the 26th of March 1950, Obafemi Awolowo invited 60 persons for a meeting in his Ibadan home to discuss the birthing of a new political movement. Only 7 people honored that invitation. They are S.O. Shonibare, Abiodun Akerele, S.T. Oredein, Olatunji Dosumo, Ola Adigun, Adeyiga Akinsoya, and Ayo Akinsoya. The biographer of Samuel Ladoke Akintola, Akijide Oshutokun, explained that Akintola, who would later deputize Awolowo in the action group, also received this invitation, but he resented the fact that Awolowo had chosen to hold a meeting towards the birthing of a political party in his home and did not attend the first meeting. He wondered why Awolowo did not use a public facility. It is possible that Awolowo chose the vicinity of his home in keeping with his federalist ideology that politics exhumes from the community of a people, for which the home was the immediate contact. Besides this, Obafemi Awolowo grew up in a very stable home, with his father and grandmother providing security for his young mind. His insistence for his wife to lead her business from the home exhumed from this worldview, and he wished to give his own children a sense of security also. It only made sense that if one was going to bat a movement that would touch the political landscape of a nation, that movement must start from the home. This tradition of holding political meetings in the home of a political leader still exists among the Yorubas to date. Between 1950 and 1951, when the action group was eventually made public, 9 such meetings were held in the home of Obafemi Awolowo. The first few gatherings were poorly attended, so much so that on the 8th of October 1950, when the 6th meeting was held, Awolowo proposed to the 9 persons who attended that the meetings should be called off. He could not understand why people were not buying into the idea of a political party, especially considering that between 60 to 100 persons were invited to each of those meetings. E.A. Babalola, Chief Showole, and Mr. Ajasin prevailed on Awolowo not to shut down the idea of a political movement at that time. They explained to him that most ideas like this one that would change the face of a nation will often start with very few people. Awolowo was encouraged to continue the project, and thankfully, subsequent meetings were better attended. On the 28th of April 1951, the action group was inaugurated in Owo, present-day Ondo State, and it was announced to the Nigerian public. Many people sent in their well wishes, including Nnamdi Azikiwe, who said that the new party's aims and objectives were laudable and its program of action is varied and wide. Awolowo made it very clear to his party men that the action group will pay very little premium to words and will be no more for action, which is where they got the name of the political group, Action Group. It was clear to the 42-year-old lawyer that if the British would relinquish power to indigenous people, they would do so only when they saw that Nigerians could govern themselves. The Action Group had 4 cardinal objectives: freedom from British rule, freedom from ignorance, freedom from disease, and freedom from want.
Ẹni bójú dọba Awólọ́wọ̀, ẹni bójú dọba Lanlẹ́yìn, ẹni bójú dọba.
From day one, the party sought to ensure that Nigeria would gain independence as early as possible. They also focused on enlightening the minds of young Nigerians. Awolowo understood that the only way Nigeria could join the Committee of Developed Countries was if its populace was largely educated. Even from the day of the NYM, Awolowo had often championed the idea of free education for young Nigerians, particularly to cater for children from indigent backgrounds. His own experience, having to labor hard to send himself to school, never left him, and he believed that every child is a creation of God with innate abilities which education will help enhance, and eventually such gifting can be used to better the lot of Nigeria as a nation. The Action Group also believed that every Nigerian must be free of disease. Awolowo often stated that anyone could be ill and that a nation's workforce would be adversely affected when medical facilities could be easily accessed by the populace. The Action Group ensured that from 1955 onwards, there was free health care for all children up to the age of 18. And lastly, the Action Group hoped to make Western Nigeria a prosperous economic hub in the country. In 1951, the John Macpherson Constitution was inaugurated in Nigeria, and it allowed a lot more positions for indigenous people in government. The Action Group went to work immediately. With the Nigerian Tribune publishing the policies of the new party to the public, the group developed a sophisticated local party system. While Zig's NTNC was quite elitist and limited its campaign to people in the urban areas, the Action Group went into the local areas and sold its party policies to the people at the grassroots. They also encouraged them to vote for the Action Group en masse with a commitment to fulfilling all the electoral promises to the people. The Action Group was the first political party in Nigeria to publish a manifesto and policy papers before an election, and they encouraged the populace to hold them accountable to their promises. It worked. In fact, by the close of their administration in 1959, they had set the pace in virtually everything as far as Nigerian politics was concerned. The Action Group had a number of qualified lawyers at the helm of affairs in the party. This included Bode Thomas, Samuel Aduke Akintola, and Awolowo himself. This meant that they took the letter of the Constitution very seriously and often had to challenge the British to obey what the Constitution of the land was saying. For example, following the election of 1951, where the Action Group won majority membership to the Western Region Parliament, the Lieutenant Governor of the region, Sir Chandos, refused to invite Awolowo, who was the leader of the party, to come and form a government. The Action Group had to resort to writing protest articles in the Nigerian Tribune before he saw their point and eventually called Awolowo for a meeting to resolve the matter. Even after they had gotten into office, Chandos insisted on choosing the officers that would run the government and also allot portfolios to them. The Action Group refused this flatly and insisted that the people elected them to government and they had the right to govern in a manner according to the electoral promises they had made to the people. Obafemi Awolowo chose to lead local government, setting the pace for Ahmadu Bello, who 2 weeks later also took up the portfolio of local government, as well as Zik, who also took up the portfolio of local government when he had returned to eastern Nigeria to lead government there. It was also quite difficult for many of the civil servants who were white men to submit to the authority of the newly elected Action Group members. But with the power of the press in their hand and sometimes employing subtle threats, the British submitted more and more to the fact that the Action Group was intent on making a success of governance. On the 10th of June 1952, Obafemi Awolowo led some Action Group executives to the Governor General of Nigeria, John Macpherson, after whom the then Constitution was named. They had a number of complaints about the Constitution, which they laid before the governor. Chief among their complaints was the fact that the Constitution did not spell out the roles of elected officials and often led the lieutenant governors to make decisions that did not carry elected officials along. Macpherson was indignant. He would not tolerate any change to a constitution that was barely a year old. He had painstakingly overseen the production of the document and could not understand why anyone would have problem with it so early. Awolowo calmly explained to him that he and his colleagues could see the defect in the constitution very easily because they were legal men who took their time to study the document and ensured its careful implementation. It was understandable that the northern and eastern region would not have any problem with the constitution since they barely used it. After hearing their complaints, the governor determined to do something about it. Owing largely to the Action Group, the Macpherson Constitution was changed to the Littleton Constitution in 1954. After the Action Group had won majority seats to the Western Region Parliament in 1951, the party decided that the leader of the party, Obafemi Awolowo, should remain in Ibadan and lead government there, while they sent 3 of their leading men to Lagos to the federal parliament to argue for constitutional changes until Nigeria got a constitution that was fit for its people. The people who went to Lagos were Bode Thomas, Samuel Ladoke Akintola, and Otto Prest. The Oni of Ife, Oba Aderemi, was also a member of the federal parliament, however without portfolio. These 4 were in the Council of Ministers. In December 1954, while the Action Group held its second annual conference, a resolution was passed to limit the end of British rule in Nigeria to December 1956. It was after this that Chief Anthony Enahoro tabled a motion for Nigeria's independence from British rule at the House of Representatives. The NCNC and the MPC opposed this motion at that time, with Ahmadu Bello making a counter motion that 1956 should be replaced with as soon as practicable. In subsequent deliberation, the NCNC came to see the point that the Action Group were making in this motion for self-government. So the 2 parties eventually ensured that this motion was put on the order of paper on the 31st of March 1953 for deliberation at the Federal Parliament. At this stage, when there was still opposition to the motion by the MPC, the Action Group and the NCNC staged a walkout of the Parliament, and the nation began to totter towards a constitutional crisis. The Secretary of the Colonies, Lord Chandos, immediately summoned Macpherson to London to explain what the issues were. On the 26th of April 1953, Chandos' Minister of State came to Nigeria and met with the Action Group, who explained the issues they had with the Constitution to him. On the 21st of May 1953, the Secretary of State, Lord Chandos, announced in the House of Commons in London that the Macpherson Constitution in Nigeria would need to be amended to allow for greater regional autonomy. The Macpherson Constitution was eventually replaced by the Littleton Constitution in 1954. The new constitution gave greater powers to indigenous rule, with the British adding that whichever region wished to have self-government could have it. It was this constitution that led to Obafemi Awolowo, leader of the Action Group, becoming the premier of the Western region in 1954, while Ahmadu Bello was made premier of the Northern region and Azikiwe became premier of the Eastern region. The constitution recognized only 3 regions, although even at that time, minority groups all around the country had begun to clamor for their own states. Obafemi Awolowo did not oppose this clamor. He felt it was in line with his principle of federalism. His point was that as long as a region or state is viable, there is no reason why it should not be created. The Action Group even supported the creation of the Midwestern region that would cater to the cry of the Edo Ishakiri people. They also believed that regions in the Mid-North ought to have their own regions, while the people of the Calabar Ogoja Rivers province ought to have their own region. The cry of the minorities for their own regions will be a leading political debate as Nigeria headed towards self-rule. Obafemi Awolowo was the driving force of the Action Group. Most of the ideas that made the party a force to reckon with were battered by him. It should also be noted that Awolowo was not a dictator among his colleagues in the party. He learned from the failures of Herbert Macaulay that if he was going to make a success of this party, he would have to listen to his colleagues, so that the collective decision of the party became binding on everyone. There were occasions when the party took decisions that Awolowo was not particularly keen on, but as long as it was the decision of the party, it was binding on himself also, even though he was the leader. One of the first principles that the Action Group made abundantly clear to members was that the party was going to be known more for actions than for words. Before 1951, Nigerians were known more for long, winding and boisterous speeches. People wrote articles in newspapers not because they wished to share ideas, but because they wanted to be known as educated elites. The Action Group will have none of this. The time was short. The party had agreed that colonial rule must end in December 1956, and there was the need to prove both to Nigerians and the British that Nigerians were capable of handling the business of government. The British had created the Nigerian nation, and there was a need to hand over the government of the country to competent men. Even at this time, the various monarchies that were replete all over the country were also vying for the seat of government. The British understood enough not to hand over governance to the monarchies because even the English crown was not involved in the day-to-day governing of that country. This was left to elected persons. The only option left was competent and educated Nigerian men. The Action Group planned to prove to the existing monarchs, the Nigerian people, and the British that they could govern the country. At the Action Group's second annual conference held in Benin in December 1952, a resolution was passed that given the proposed date of the Nigeria's independence, which had been appointed as December 1956, it was decided that all members of the Action Group would celebrate every first day of December as Nigeria's Liberation Day. The plan was to arouse in people the consciousness that everything was being done to rid the nation of British rule. The first of these celebrations was held on the 1st of December 1953, and the Action Group continued to hold this event until Nigeria gained independence on the 1st of October 1960. Another thing that the Action Group employed towards British rule was that they made a commitment not to utilize violence to rid the land of the British. Obafemi Awolowo often said that people who employed violence to get something would always have to use violence to keep it. He said that violence rips at the soul of a man, and the one who lives by the gun will die by the gun. Awolowo was convinced that the tenor of events both in Nigeria and Britain did not require the use of violence. He maintained the point that the English still regarded Nigeria as its investment, and that if Nigerians will acquire these investments from them, Nigerians will need to prove that they can do a better job at governing the country. It was this commitment to freedom from British rule that led Anthony Enahoro to move the motion for Nigeria's independence in 1953. Enahoro had not discussed the matter at party level the morning he moved the motion. He was so enamored by the idea that morning of the 13th of March 1953 that he turned to the leader of the party, Awolowo, and asked his permission to move the motion. Awolowo thought about it for a moment and gave his consent. Awolowo reasoned that since the party had this motion as its cardinal point of action, it had decided in its last annual conference to place 1956 as the date of the exit of the British. There was no need for another permission from the party caucus for this motion to be moved. After Enahoro had moved the motion, some members of the Action Group criticized him and Awolowo for being too forward on the matter. They felt that they still needed to bid their time on it, especially to get the support of the MPC before bringing it to Parliament. Awolowo disagreed with them. With that motion moved, the subject of the end to British rule became a matter of debate in the Nigerian Parliament. Both the MPC and the NCNC rejected the idea at first, although the NCNC eventually came around to agreeing to the motion, but the MPC asked that the year 1956 be moved to a year that was most feasible for independence. Obafemi Awolowo, as leader of the Action Group, took office substantively on the 6th of February 1952. The biggest challenge that was set before him was how he and his colleagues in the Action Group would find the money to fulfill their electoral promises. The British, many of whom were senior officers in the civil service at the time, were convinced that the Action Group would never be able to source for the funds to meet all these high-sounding electoral promises. The Action Group in 1951 made 7 cardinal promises to the people of the western region of Nigeria. Number 1, there will be free universal primary education for children of school-going age. Number 2, free medical treatment for children up to the age of 18. Number 3, 1 hospital for each of the 24 administrative divisions in the region, which did not have one already. Number 4, improvement in agricultural techniques and higher returns to farmers. Number 5, better wages for the working class. Number 6, improvement in existing roads and bridges and construction of new ones. Number 7, water supply to urban and rural areas. The Action Group estimated that education and health alone will go up £10 million, with a recurrent expenditure of £3 million by 1954 and 1955. It looked almost impossible that their electoral promises would be kept. One of the earliest ways Awolowo and the Action Group got money for their project was to save up on some excesses in government spending. In those days, there was such a thing as expatriation pay. It was an extra allowance that was given to foreigners who took up job in the Nigerian Civil Service. The Action Group reasoned that if Nigerians were given those jobs, there would be no need to pay an expatriation pay. And still in keeping with the quick Nigerianization of the civil service, it only made sense to employ Nigerians instead of the British. The only situation where an expatriate was employed in the civil service was when a Nigerian did not have the requisite skill to do the job. The 1952-53 draft budget had a surplus of £101,000. This new policy of the Action Group increased that sum to £128,000. Nigerians were very pleased by this policy. even though the NCNC did not think it was worth much. Another way the Action Group got funding was via the Developmental Funding and Welfare Act that the British government provided to the three regions of Nigeria. These funds were provided between 1951 and 1955, and another sum came between 1955 and 1960, totaling about £36 million. Other regions of the country got a lot more than the Western region, but the Action Group used their resources quite meticulously, and the people could see what these monies were being used for. The total revenue for the 1952-53 year for the Western region was £4.79 million. To cut costs, the Awolowo government insisted that it would not build staff quarters for civil servants. They encouraged staff to hire houses they could live in within town. This way, the money budgeted for staff housing was saved. Even after they left government, Obafemi Awolowo frowned at the practice of using government resources to build a government house. He believed that most people would be comfortable building their own houses and staying there when they were in government and even after they have left office. This was something he exemplified, and this is a tradition that still exists in southwest states in Nigeria. State governments do not build staff quarters. Instead, they encourage workers to build their own houses. Then it occurred to Awolowo that the monies budgeted to build state-of-the-art schools could be reduced considerably if, rather than build permanent structures, buildings with mud walls could be erected that could serve as makeshift structures pending when government could replace them. When the government approached expatriates to do the work, they frowned at the concept, but Nigerian builders bought into the idea, and the structures were so well erected that they were going to serve the schools for no less than 50 years. The concept brought down educational capital expenditure from £9 million to £3 million. Despite all these monies being saved and raised, the capital expenditure needed to finance the free education and free health system of the Action Group could still not be reached. Then the Action Group introduced a tax scheme of 10 shillings a month for every adult. The Lieutenant Governor, Hugo Marshall, bought into the idea and got all government officials in the provinces to cooperate with the scheme. The NCNC, which was the party in the opposition, felt that the tax was too much and insisted that it should be reduced to 2.6 shillings. The Action Group held their grounds. The opposition then used the tax matter to make the Action Group quite unpopular, and it even affected their electoral pollings in 1954, with the Action Group losing several seats to the NCNC in that year's election. However, between 1953 and 1955, when the tax was imposed and the free education scheme was to start, the Awolowo government was able to raise its revenue by £11 million. The target date to commence the free education and free health services was January 1955, and everything was being done to realize the money for it. A breakthrough came for the Action Group when the federal government regionalized the Commodity Marketing Board. An accumulated reserve of £34 million was therefore transferred to the Western region. This led to a leap in the annual revenue of the Action Group, and all the resources that was needed to finance the campaign promises of the Action Group was now available. They therefore got to work. Apart from the free education scheme for primary school students, the Action Group awarded £80,000 to 200 post-secondary school students on scholarship. At that time, the highest number of scholarship any government in Nigeria had handed out had only been to 20 students. £25,000 was allotted for recreational facilities. All work but no play makes Jack a dull boy, they reasoned. Awolowo credits the success of his administration to the almost fanatical commitment to work that the men who worked with him put into their jobs. Many of them bought into the vision of their leader and worked with the same discipline he exhumed at his job. In those days, politicians were more intent on making a good impression on the populace through their work than the amount of money they could earn. Awolowo was said to have earned so little that while he was in government, he decided to collect his salary in an accumulated format every quarter. Most politicians of those days lived off the goodwill of the people and never stole government resources. Obafemi Awolowo, despite being the leader of the Action Group, also held the portfolio of local government between 1952 and 1954. He headed finance between 1954 and 1955, and he led economic planning between 1955 and 1959. By the close of their government in 1959, the overall perception of people all around the world was that the Action Group had done very well. It was their performance more than anything else that convinced the British that Nigerians could govern themselves. and this expedited the process of granting full independence to Nigerians. Among other things, the government of Obafemi Awolowo established the University of Ife, now called the Obafemi Awolowo University. It started the tradition of free education and free health care in any government in Nigeria. They also embarked on a massive agricultural scheme, providing farmers with loans and modern agricultural implements to improve their production. The biggest source of revenue for the action group at this time was cocoa and oil palm produce, and the Awolowo government made great effort to invest in these sectors so as to improve yields. At the time when the federal government minimum wage was £2 4 shillings, the Western region was paying their workers a minimum wage of £5. The very last act of the Awolowo government in 1959 was the opening of the Western Nigerian Television, WNTV, in 1959, the first television station in the whole of Africa. The WNTV is now NTA Ibadan. When this station was built, many European countries did not have a TV station. The Awolowo government built that station to help improve entertainment and information dissemination among Nigerians. By the close of their government in 1959, the western region of Nigeria was the place to live in. The economy of the region was booming and was rivaling any economy one could find in the western parts of the world. The action group had achieved their goals. They were freeing the people of the western region from ignorance, disease, and want. And the other greater freedom from British rule, was still paramount in their hearts. The blessing that history provides us is our ability to look at epochs in a collective manner and come to reasonable conclusions on them so that latter generations could learn from the mistakes of their forebears. One of the saddest and most challenging narratives in Nigerian history is the Nigerian Civil War of 1967 to 1970. Interestingly, Obafemi Awolowo will be a central figure in the whole conflict. When the British came to Nigeria in the middle of the 19th century, they found many Nigerian communities at war with each other. They then enacted the Pax Britannica, which made it illegal for a community to go to war against one another. What usually led to conflict between communities was disagreements, perhaps over lands and resources. The British instituted a system of laws that was binding on all citizens, so that the nation, which is Nigeria, that the British had now created, could only exist as long as everyone obeyed the laws of the land. Therefore, court systems were developed, the police was instituted to keep law and order, and lawyers existed to help argue the cases of people in a law court. When people do not feel that they have been cheated, they will usually not take the law into their hands. Therefore, peace would naturally exist in a place where everybody respected laws. The British also ensured that cases could be appealed not just to the Supreme Court in Nigeria, but also to a higher court system in England called the Privy Council. At the heart of the laws of a land was the constitution the land operated with. It was therefore paramount to Awolowo and his colleagues in the action group to ensure that Nigeria enacted a working constitution. It should be noted that the moment Nigeria ceased to obey its own laws after the British had left, the country degenerated into a civil war, the same state the British had met her when they came. In 1951, the Macpherson Constitution was set in place for the country. The action group did not think it represented the wishes of the people of Nigeria enough. The constitution would eventually be replaced by the Little Thing Constitution in 1954. It was clear, however, that at independence the country would need another constitution. Therefore, starting in 1957, leaders from the various regions of the country went to London to discuss enacting a workable constitution for independent Nigeria. One of the things that was debated in this constitution was the matter of recognizing minority groups in the country. The British understood that the key ethnic groups in Nigeria were more than Hausa, Igbo, and Yoruba. There was the need to create more states that would recognize these minority groups and that would give them greater say concerning things that pertain to their people. In keeping with the principle of federalism, Obafemi Awolowo and the Action Group were willing to grant the people of the Edo region of Nigeria their own state. They argue, however, that that would mean a reduction in the size of the western region. It made sense that the northern region and the eastern region grant recognition to minority groups in their own regions also. At the time, the people in the middle belt of Nigeria had been clamoring for their own region. The people in the Calabar-Ogoja region had also been clamoring for their own region. Awolowo argued that all these regions should be created before the country got its independence from the British. The two other premiers in Nigeria, the Sardauna and Ezekwe in the east, saw the point in Awolowo's view, and they agreed to have a meeting over the matter. On the 16th and 17th of April 1957, the three premiers met in Lagos and discussed extensively the nature of the country after the British had left. Chief among their discussion was what will happen to minority groups and the need to create more states to reflect the federal nature that the country must have. With regards to the creation of the state, the three premiers agreed on the following points. Number one, that the wishes of a people in the proposed area to be created should be determined by plebiscite or referendum. Number two, that the creation of a new state must be consistent with the principle of viability. Number three, that the component units of the new state should be geographically contiguous. Number four, that no ethnic group should be split into a new state except with the wishes of the people determined by plebiscite or referendum. The premiers agreed for Awolowo to draft a memorandum that reflected these agreements and to bring it with him to London, where they were all going to append their signatures. When they arrived in London and met again to read the document and sign, the MPC made it clear that they were not going to sign the document and that the only thing they were going to agree to in the Constitutional Conference in London was with regards to Nigeria's independence from the British. The MPC took this position because the NCNC had gone behind everyone's back and, contrary to the spirit of the agreement reached by the Premier, submitted a new list of conditions to the British authorities for the creation of new states. When it became clear that if the various parties to the Constitutional Conference were going to remain divided over the matter of creation of states, the British made it clear that they had no choice but to postpone the date of Nigeria's independence. Awolowo and the Action Group will have none of this. They were therefore willing to let the matter of the creation of new states remain at bay while the country gained her independence and then returned to the matter later. The conference agreed that the nation was to head for election in 1959 and the British Parliament's system of government was to be adopted for Nigeria. Obafemi Awolowo and the Action Group quickly got into the trenches to win the federal elections. As of 1959, the country's political system was divided along ethnic lines. The Northern People's Congress, which is the MPC, held sway over the northern region of Nigeria. The National Council of Nigeria and the Cameroons, NCNC, held the hold on the eastern parts of Nigeria, while the Action Group was largely dominant in the western part of Nigeria. Sadly, Nigerian politics had taken up ethnic dimension, and it was clear that the region that was larger in size would win majority of votes. Nevertheless, the Action Group were not to be deterred. The party raked up a financial machinery and invested no less than £10 million in the 1959 election. Awolowo was a grassroots politician and he knew the terrain well. The Action Group had individuals running for office in every part of the country. Awolowo would enter into the region of the north and speak to the ordinary people of those places, selling the Action Group's policies to them. On one occasion, it was reported to the Sardauna of Sokoto, Ahmadu Bello, that he would need to leave his house and enter the campaign trail or the Action Group would win northern Nigeria. This forced the Sardauna to go on campaigns. On one of such outings, he suffered so much discomfort on the trip that he promised not to forgive Awolowo for it all. Election day was the 12th of December 1959. There were 312 seats in the House of Representatives to be contested. The MPC won 134 seats, the NCNC got 81 seats, and the Action Group got 73 seats. Other parties got 24 seats in all. It was clear that a coalition between the NCNC and the Action Group would have allowed the people in the South to rule the country. Obafemi Awolowo was even willing to be subordinate to Zik and serve as his Minister of Finance in his cabinet. But the bad blood between the two men since the Nigerian youth movement days was still lingering. The NCNC chose to enter a coalition with the MPC, with the MPC appointing the Prime Minister and Zik becoming the Governor General of Nigeria. Obafemi Awolowo and the Action Group were content with being in the opposition. In the Action Group, Awolowo and his colleagues decided that it would be better if he moved to Lagos and offered stringent opposition to the government in power. The deputy leader of the party, Samuel Ladoke Akintola, was made the premier of the Western region, taking over office from the leader of the party, Awolowo. Bode Thomas had been Awolowo's deputy up to 1953 when he died quite suddenly from an illness. Some have speculated that if Thomas was alive, he would have been the premier instead of Akintola. The source of our information for Obafemi Awolowo's early life comes mostly from his own autobiography titled Awo. That book was published in 1960 on the eve of Nigeria's independence from the British. It is understandable now why Awolowo was quite critical of Nnamdi Azikiwe in that book. Nigeria would have benefited greatly from two great minds and two progressive-looking parties if they had managed to put their differences behind them and worked together. Another point should be made. Obafemi Awolowo was a mortal man with his own deep insecurities. It is not easy to be able to trace what those insecurities were as one reads his book. It is, however, clear that some of them showed up in his relationship with the persons that took power from the British. For example, Akintola had been in the Federal House of Representatives since 1951, and he had managed to work quite amicably with Tafawa Balewa. Akintola it was, as Minister of Health, who helped to institute the creation and the building of the University College Hospital in Ibadan in 1957. Akintola spoke impeccable Hausa, having lived in the north as a child, and he got along very well working with Tafawa Balewa while they were in Lagos. However, it appears that the moment Awolowo reached Lagos, he was committed to holding the government accountable on every point of doctrine in government. Now, this kind of thing could be done in more developed democracies like those of the United Kingdom. However, in Nigeria, with men who were in power, who had their own insecurities, and whose every action was being held under the microscope of the Lagos Press and the Nigerian Tribune, it was only a matter of time before Awolowo will begin to have problems with them. Obafemi Awolowo took his job as opposition leader quite seriously. He was convinced that he could show the Nigerian public that the Balewa government was not up to the task in governance, and that he and his party, the Action Group, could do a better job governing Nigeria. One cannot also rule out a tendency towards pride on his part. The Action Group, against all expectation, had done tremendously well governing the Western region. There was a tendency then for Awolowo and his men to have a smug attitude towards the Northerners who led the country in Lagos. Some might say Awolowo took his job in the opposition too far. Others will say he was doing what he was supposed to do. We tell these stories so that Nigerians can be informed of their history and also make informed decisions about their future in relation to their country.
Akintola o tiwa ni Awolowo Jonalaga o Bode Deputy tiwa Awolowo